Greetings and salutations, and welcome to Vesperisms, the art of thinking for yourself. I'm your host, author-illustrator Vesper Stamper, and I'm here to help recalibrate your artistic worldview. So why don't you grab your coffee and have a seat here in my studio and let's have a chat. Well, here we are in Season 2 of Vesperisms. Happy New Year, everyone. Man, how many of you were waiting to hear those words? It's almost like it's too good to be true. I'll bet any year that doesn't end in 2-0 feels like a good one to write on your dentist forms or your checks, right? So without further ado, I present to you Vesperisms Season 2, Episode 1, A Community by Any Other Name. If you're new to Vesperisms, I strongly encourage you to go back and listen through Season 1, where I laid out the foundation for what this podcast is. It's just a little bit different than many podcasts on art or creativity that you've probably listened to. And if you're wondering who I am, I'm a literary illustrator who also writes novels of historical fiction for young adults. So as we round out the meta year that was 2020 into the unknown of 2021, there's one word that has consistently come to meet me on the wrestling mat, and I'm going to take it on. That word is community. We've heard for a long time, right, about various communities that we're either a part of or that we should put particular focus on based on what current events present themselves to us in the urgency and nonstop nature of the 24-hour news cycle and our social media feeds. Whether it's the kidlit community, the knitting community, the Black community, the illustration community, the Jewish community, the LGBT community, the student community, the Christian community, the dance community, the disabled community, the Muslim community, the healthcare community, the gaming community, the neuroatypical community, the science community, the vegan community, the activist community. In the words of Inigo Montoya, I do not think that word means what you think it means. Are you ready to hear something radical? Common interest or common characteristic groups, they're not communities. That doesn't mean that they're not valuable or important. Of course they are. Homesteading, for example, is something I really enjoy learning about. I'm not a homesteader myself, but I do a lot of related acts of domesticity, and I love to geek out on anything having to do with sheep, or fermented foods, or chicken coops, or needlework. And there are multiple thousands of people like me who I can find online and talk to. But let's be real. Beyond that single focus, homesteaders writ large have very little to do with my life. As multifaceted as these subjects may be, they're still fairly narrow. Single interest groups are not communities. They are networks. To put it simply, anything that would have a Facebook page or a hashtag on Twitter, it's not a community. It's a network. So why is it important as an artist to make that distinction? Why am I taking this on? What's with the one-woman crusade? Well, the biggest reason is that we all, almost all of us, are desperately lonely. Loneliness, anxiety and depression, suicidality, diseases of despair, these were all rising drastically before the events of 2020. But now they are skyrocketing. They in themselves are a pandemic. The reasons for that are obvious, right? Why were these things rising before? I believe it's due in part to the misuse of this word community, especially on social media. And artists are susceptible to this, partly because of our incredible openness, as well as the incredible isolation it often takes to create our work. So I'm recording this here in my studio, and as a studio artist, I'm alone for most of the day. I work here in my home studio from about 8 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, and then I tend to do a second shift after dinner. But see, I'm naturally an extrovert who's energized by people, and so it's important for me and for my work to get that in-person, face-to-face people time. The quality of my work as a writer and an illustrator depends on it. So in a normal year, I'd be bringing my work to a local cafe or getting together with friends and seeing my regular acquaintances at my daughter's dance school or whatever. But a few years ago, like a lot of my fellow New Yorkers this year, I moved away from my big, beautiful, bustling city to this small, semi-rural town on its outskirts, and I really underestimated the social cost of that decision. In a normal year, if I was going through something, for example, I usually knew at least 2 people whose lives were stable enough that I could call them or I could go to their houses and talk it out. Or if the roles were reversed, I had the energy to help someone else in that situation. But now, with everyone's lives upended and masks covering over the markers of our emotions and the premature deaths or long illnesses of our loved ones, and all of us a little afraid of anyone we would stand in line with at the post office, it's no wonder we're all dealing with a rise in things like loneliness, anxiety, panic attacks, or just a general sense of disconnection with others. So let's say we go online to try to find commonality with others that are going through the same thing. Maybe we read some reviews on Amazon and we pick up a book on depression. And maybe we find a book group on Facebook. Well, 50,000 people who have all read the same book on depression are not a community. They have no tangible way of helping you beyond commiseration on that one subject. They're a network. And we all need and appreciate networks. A network can be incredibly helpful for finding resources, but it's not going to be there for you in the trenches. A network is not going to be there when your marriage is on the rocks. A network is not going to sit in your living room letting you cry on its shoulder. A network is not going to bring you a meal after you have a baby or, God forbid, you have cancer, because a network cannot care for you along anything else but a single path. A community has to do with complexity. A community will be there to care for you. I want to tell you a story. It may sound like a sob story at first, but I promise it's not. Just stay with me. Back when I got my first major book contract, I had a big wake-up call. This was the single biggest thing to happen in my career. I had slogged for 17 long years to try to accomplish this, and here it was, my big break. A 2-book deal with a major publisher. As a novelist, not just an illustrator. So I did what you do. I posted the announcement on Facebook, and I got a bunch of likes. But you know what I didn't get? One single solitary phone call, or text, or card, or friend asking me out for celebratory drinks or coffee, or flowers, or beautiful writerly gifts. Nothing. Nada. Zilch. But you know what? I knew that I had no one to blame but myself, because the fact was that I had been operating along my own single interest network for years, and that network was my own career. I had put my career ahead of my friendships, and the isolation that ensued was, frankly, at least largely my own fault. And I knew that writing a book about the Holocaust, for example, which was what my first book was about, was something that I was not going to be able to get through without support. It was the single loneliest time in my life, and it happened to happen right around the holidays. And I've had some pretty lonely times, but this one took the cake. I knew that this was not going to be solved by being more active on social media and trying to trump that up as my community. No. I needed friends. I needed true community. So I thought of about 5 or 6 friends who I had history with, people who I felt really understood me, who I didn't need to explain myself to, the kind of people you can just kind of pick up where things left off even if it was years ago, right? Well, I called them, and I clearly explained the support I was going to need, and I asked them to walk with me. All of them, every single one, graciously said yes. And one of these friends even came with me on a tour of concentration camps in Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic, and made sure I took care of myself while I researched. That's a real friend. That's community. Are any of these friends that I'm talking about also fellow illustrators? No. I have good friends who are illustrators too, but the ones I'm talking about, this core group, they're not in that network. A few of them are writers, but they're in completely different genres than myself. They're not part of any of my networks. They are part of my community. And I've learned by walking with them to reciprocate their care and to give back to this little community as well. And years later, we're still walking with each other. Our family's had a hard time in this small town since moving here 4 years ago. I hate to say it, but it's a pretty antisocial place, to be honest. Or at least I'm saying this as a lifelong city girl with only a population of 17 million to compare it to. I've been glad to make a handful of friendships, but it takes effort in a town culture where it doesn't come naturally. One thing that's been really tough for us is finding a church. We really love church. It's grounding for us as a family. We love being part of a story that's bigger and older than us and our quotidian concerns. But the churches where we live have kind of felt like an awkward fit. As this crazy year's gone on, I've found myself longing even more for church. The more smells and bells, the better. Sit, stand, kneel, recite, sing, jump around, shout amen. I love all of it. But the thing that makes it the most beautiful is its inherent difference. In any given sanctuary of a church or a synagogue, most of us would never choose to spend time together. Trust me. We would never normally find ourselves in the same building. Let's face it, most people think that artists are weirdos, and most artists think the same about other people. We really honestly do think that we are the normal ones. I desperately miss the act of singing together, of taking communion from a common cup, of sitting together as we hear a teaching, of reading from a common book, as we listen together to announcements and we nod to each other that yes, we will be going to the picnic at Riverside Park next week. I miss being in each other's homes. I miss sharing in a common life. This is a precious, transcendent thing that is vital for the human experience. And I dare say it's vital for the artist. And we've been losing it for a long time. And this year made the situation critical. In the case of church, I don't know when that's coming back or how it will change when it does. I was telling this to my wonderful therapist, and I highly recommend finding a wonderful therapist. And she said, there's a certain contingency of people who will never go back to church because they realize that they can curl up in their jammies with their coffee and a cozy blanket and tune into their favorite preacher who might be half a world away, all in the comfort of their own home. And when she said this, I almost threw up. So let me get this straight. The lesson in a year of global loneliness is not how much more vital it is that we support each other and bear each other's burdens, or that we think of ways to safely gather and look each other in the eye and to comfort those who feel isolated and alone, but how to make our lives more comfortable, more isolated, more inward. The lesson is to divest entirely from community. I've come to dub this jammy church. Do you know why jammy church is no substitute for the real thing? Because jammy church is a network. We tune into the same YouTube channel, but we don't feel each other's collective amen hanging in the air. We don't see the anguish in the face of a friend whose wife has just walked out on him. We don't feel responsible for the future of someone's children who's running around at our feet. Community means that we take our places in a story larger than us. Whether that's a faith story or a town story, or even the story of your apartment building. Community depends on difference more than commonality. We find our commonality not in single interest networks alongside us, but in the stories that are larger than us. Artists may need this sense of community more than many because so much of our work is alone. We are in our heads 90% of the time, thinking of our own vision and concerns or those of our single interest networks. Social media, and yes, artists are just as addicted to it as everyone else. It's convinced us that the block of salt we're eating is actually, no, really guys, it's real bread. This has done immeasurable damage to our true connections and our sense of responsibility toward real people, as opposed to interests or worse, political abstractions. Remember, one tenet of Vesperisms is that art is human-centered. So I'm going to do something radical here. I'm rejecting the term community, except as it applies to a loose affiliation of diverse people who actually have personal dealings with each other and a common stake in each other's real lives. Everything else, I'm calling a network, and I encourage you to as well. One thing I've tried to be conscious of as this year begins is to refuse to think of last year as a total waste. There's always that tendency to tell the old year, good riddance, don't let the doorknob hit you on the way out. But this year, I didn't want to miss the lessons it could have for us. Having written a novel about the Great Plague of 1348, I knew that were it not for the devastation of that 14th century pandemic, you and I would simply not be sitting here in the modern world. As I said in the last episode of Season 1, the advances that came out of the plague included the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, modern democracy, germ theory, and a cascade of advances that changed the story of the previous millennia of human experience from one that was for almost everyone nasty, brutish, and short, to one in which we can possibly dream beyond our 35th birthday. When we lament the loss or lack of community in our lives, that's often a sign that we hold the key to something. Look, communities are nothing more than groups of individuals, and we can wrap our minds around that, right? As we enter a new year, I know that our common life is going to look different for some time, but I want to be part of the solution. And I want to challenge all of you Vesperisms listeners to join me. Let's brainstorm. What are 3 ways that you can build community this year? Could you host a line dancing class in the park and advertise it in your local message board? Can you invite one person or family over each month and cook dinner together? Call it, as my friend Noelle does, First Friday with Friends. Something regularly that you hold yourself to. My husband Ben and I are looking at some ways to safely gather people in our community, to care for each other and our differences, to reweave those connections that social media promised but ultimately betrayed. Besides checking in with people privately, we've delivered cookies, we've made actual long phone calls, we're looking at starting a monthly singing club where we're going to get together outside around the fire pit for now, and we're going to sing old spirituals and Beatles songs and 80s pop, whatever people want to sing, just so we can hear each other sing and laugh, and we can learn to be safe but not afraid. Ultimately, I want to fill my home again, and I'm not letting go of that vision. I want a crowd of people around my table with a big pot of soup and homemade bread. I want the criers on my couch. I want the little kids in my living room playing with blocks and trains. A network can't care for people like that. The time is now for rebuilding true community in whatever ways we can. Thanks for joining me for this week's Vesperisms. If you found value in this episode, by all means, would you leave me a 5-star review on iTunes and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you're watching it there? The YouTube channel is called Vesperisms. That'll help others to find this podcast and spread the message of an artistic worldview to more people. You can follow me on Instagram at Vesperisms and subscribe to my newsletter at vesperisms.com to get news about my work, and you'll get a free outtake chapter from my newest book, A Cloud of Outrageous Blue. You can buy my books wherever you love to buy books, and please ask at your local independent bookstore first. They can order it for you even if they don't carry it. And when you've read my books, the best thing you could do would be to leave me a great review on Amazon. That helps me as an author immensely. Music for Vesperisms is provided by Ben and Vesper, and that's my band. My friend, we've got to support each other in this tough and vital work of creating honest work and life for the world that we're a part of, because your voice is important. Your contribution matters. And just remember, work isn't everything, but everything is the work. See you next time.